Hello guys and girls, Screwzilla here, and I hope you're all magnifique aujourd'hui. Thunder Armée de l'air has been announced today, at long last. And I apologise for anyone that actually speaks French well. I've got terrible pronunciation in French, so yes, sorry about that. Anyway, news we've all sort of waiting for. And although I guess people are a bit more interested in the French tanks than the Armée de l'air, as France was well not well known for its air forces after the devastation of the Battle of France. Many falsely believe that France was a pushover in the Second World War, and although some of the tanks are well known, many of the planes are forgotten about and thought to be inadequate. A lot of the French planes were considered to be sort of useless due to the ease at which the Germans steamrolled over the French. Similar to the Italian Air Force. How many people didn't think the Italians had many good planes, which is a bit of poppycock, really, because they really did. However, anyone in the know knows that Italians and French were some of the leaders in avionics in the 30s and 40s, and 20s as well, and the French, of course, had some of the best planes in the First World War. They were the first air force as well, the first proper air force. So they've got a good history in the air. But lack of resources and terrible politics hampered many of their projects. Where the Italians had the bomber race won pretty much, the French created some of the best heavy fighters, float planes, and some very good fighters, in fact. The odd part with the late 30s was how quickly aviation was progressing. There was many new ideas and lots of people still using the old ones. Biplanes were still very much in use, especially for mountainous regions, good jungles as well, and of course the Navy. The increased lift coefficient of a biplane greatly made it quite a useful plane to have. Also, the low stall speed, things like that, helped for naval combat because it was much easier to land on a ship, for instance. And the fact it could pretty much land anywhere and take off from anywhere, biplanes were still quite popular. But the world of air combat was moving to speed and altitude now. The war the French had expected to fight did not happen. It was not like the last war, with long stalemates, with trenches having your planes close to the stagnant front lines. Now war was on the move. It was about mobility. You needed a mobile, fast-moving army. The French had made a huge blunder with this. The Maginot Line had failed the blitzkrieg tactics of the Germans. The German army caught the main French and Commonwealth armies sort of napping almost, and they were forced to retreat, and France was lost, along with many prototypes of their air force and many of their planes. The French relied upon Allied and Axis aircraft instead of their own towards the end, even using captured planes in the French colonies, sort of Indochina area where the French had many islands still. At one stage they had captured an A6M2 float plane, and they were the only other air force other than Japan to use it in combat. After the occupation of France had completed and the end of World War II, the rebuilding had started. So did their aviation industry. France went on to make some amazing jets in the post-war period, using knowledge from their allies and old enemies to build their own planes. So a bit of a brief overview of the history there. Now let us try to work out what we may get. Let the speculation begin. Now, I'm going to start with lower sort of BR bombers. I know, I'm a bomber nut, I'm sorry, but I love my bombers so much. So I'm going to start with the bombers. First of all, we'll look at the Laurette Olivier Leo 25 maritime patrol bomber and float plane. Now, this was an interwar plane, and this may be our very first biplane medium bomber for War Thunder, and I really do hope we get this one. It's a bit of a relic of the First World War. This plane would make for a great starter bomber for the French, and could come in both land and maritime forms, because this plane was also a float plane. It it could be used for both areas. With the upcoming naval beta, and naval patches coming in the future, Navy forces are going to be something of a useful factor in that. So having a maritime plane such as this may be quite useful. It served the French from 1928 until 1945. As you can see, quite a long service history. Yes, it's an older design, and yes, it is a biplane, but it had its uses. It's got a relatively good bomb load, up to 1,300 pounds of bombs, or it could carry a single torpedo. It has 2 to 4, depending on the loadout, 303 Dime machine guns, scattered all across the plane. So this might be a good starter, sort of the first plane to unlock for the bombers. Next, we'll be looking at the Emirate 143 medium bomber. Outdated when it first flew, the Emirate suffered horrible losses when Germany invaded. It's a simple twin-engine bomber with static landing gear. It was mainly used as a night bomber due to its poor speed and defensive armaments, mainly because it got a bit of a beating during the first stages of the war. They were trying to use it in daylight raids, but it was just simply too slow. It was too easy, too much of an easy target. So this plane again has 4 303 machine guns, Mach 1934 machine guns, and carries a bomb load of 3,500 pounds. So a decent load of bombs there. One of the sort of heavier loads in the game, if they do actually work it out to be that much. Of course, Gaijin do sometimes play around with bomb loads a little bit, unfortunately. The Lincoln comes to mind. So hopefully these will get their proper bomb loads. Next up, we'll look at the Bloch 210 medium bomber. It's another bomber from the 1930s. The Bloch 210 was a more advanced medium bomber and a civil airliner. The 210 proved to lack engine reliability and speed, and was grounded until a fix came along with the Nomrand 14N series engines. They were used over the prior engines because they were having too many heating issues. The plane had quite a service history. It was used after the occupation by the Germans. It was mainly used as a transporter, but it did have quite a few it did have a relatively decent run as a bomber. It's a slightly more advanced plane over the Amat 143. Now this plane comes with 3 MAC 1934 machine guns, and it carries up to 3,500 pounds of bombs. Next up, we'll look at the Léa et Olivier LEO 45 medium. Now this is where we come into the more advanced planes. So this one was one of the most advanced bombers when it was laid down. The LEO 45 was simply not ready in time to make a difference for France, however. It was one of the few planes to gain success in the Battle of France, with a number of bombing raids. And it was one of the first and only bombers to conform to the new doctrine for fast medium bombers. The LEO 45 was considered the best bomber in the world when it first flew, capable of over 300 miles per hour in level flight, so it was quite a fast beast. Now, this plane had some good uses in the Battle of France. It was quite a successful bomber. I imagine this would be sort of the tier 2 sort of area of bombers, along with the next plane in our list. So this plane comes with a single 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannon, which was placed in the rear of the plane, I believe, and then it had 2 more 303 MAC 1934 machine guns on board. It carried a very respectable 3,450 pound bomb load. So one of the good things for the French bombers will be that they should be able to take out a couple of bases, at least, in games, which will make it quite useful for bomber players. Last but not least, for the bombers, we'll be looking at the Amuar 354 fast medium bomber. This was a very fast, very capable medium bomber. The 354 was designed as a fast transport mail plane, but went on to become a great bomber. Although it lacked numbers by the time of the German attack, it did make some good runs, mainly on Holland. It attacked the German armies in Holland generally, and I think Belgium as well. So it was used in that sort of area. They, along with the Leo 45, they tried to escape some of these planes to Africa once France had fallen. It was a very, very good bomber though. Similar to the 45, it's got a very good defensive armament of the single Hispano 20mm cannon, along with two 303 MAC 1945s, a slightly upgraded version of the 34. It carries 2,650 pounds of bombs, so a little bit less payload than the Leo 45, but it should be a reasonably good bomber. I imagine those two will be sort of the second tier of the French bomb tech tree. Alrighty, let's move on to the attackers now. This is not an overall order, this one, but I expect we will have all of these planes. I'm not doing this too ordered just because it's a little bit tricky with the French aircraft. So, of course, we'll start off with the Laurier Nieuport LN 401 and 402 as well. Dive bomber. What do you get if you put a Stuka on a boat? This, pretty much. The LN40, the LN401, is a carrier-based dive bomber with the gull-wing design and looks very similar to a Stuka. Although it was developed as a two-man plane, it was revised to a single-seater after early problems with the prototype. Sadly, the test pilots perished in a crash. The plane was grounded after that, of course, and I think it was around about 1937, 36. It was developed and grounded. Might have been as late as 38. And they sort of were trying to work around some of the problems. Now, this plane's considered a bit of a flop. It was a bit of a problem plane due to the rushed development time, but that's simply it. It was rushed in development time. It was not a bad plane overall, and if it had its time to be tweaked and finished, then maybe, just maybe, it could have been a good dive bomber. Especially as a carrier-based dive bomber, it had quite a good lift rating as well. So it could have done a lot more than it did, I reckon. So it'll be interesting to see it, and it's a plane that I'm quite interested in as well. And Nieuport, of course, are famous for their World War I plane manufacturing. Some of the best fighters of the First World War. So, the LN401 comes with a single 20mm cannon in the nose, along with two 303 Dian machine guns in the wings, and can carry 500 pounds of bombs. So a single 500-pound bomb in its just under the fuselage. That's the word I'm looking for. Next up is the POTS 630 heavy fighter / attacker. Now the POTS 630 is a twin-engine heavy fighter, all-metal construction. It was a relatively good airframe and a relatively good plane for manoeuvring, but the engines were lacking. Its biggest flaw were the engines, as they restricted performance. It was unable to go up against the German fighters it was designed for, simply because it lacked speed. But what it lacked as speed for a fighter, it made up for as a ground attacker and reconnaissance plane. This plane was very successful at ground attacking and reconnaissance. So the plane has two Hispano 20mm and it has a single 707 rear-facing machine gun, as well as four 707 MAC 1934s in the wings. So it's very heavily armed. So you've got twin cannons and four 707s in this thing, so it's going to be a relatively vicious beast. It could carry up to 110 pounds of bombs. I think it carried the 20-pound bombs on board. A couple of, maybe, I think it was something like a 50 and a couple of the 20s. So not a huge bomb load, but it does have bomb capability. Next up, we'll be looking at the Breguet BR-690 ground attacker and dive bomber. Now, the Breguet was the French answer to the Mosquito, the Bf-110, the P-38, a modern heavy multi-role fighter. The 690 was actually taken on as a private venture. it was too heavy to conform to the requirements um, of the Armée de l'Air um, for the heavy fighter role at the time. So the Breguet company took it on as a private venture because they knew this plane was decent. Um, the aforementioned P630 was the winning plane for this time period. These two are at the same time. The risk for the Breguet company did pay off, however. The plane turned out to be extremely good, even being a little bit too heavy. The main reason it was not considered was because of its weight. It was a good, fast, agile plane and armed to the teeth too. Um, it it didn't have great numbers, of course, which is the story of all of the French planes, unfortunately, but it was a very good performer. The main thing for this was the fact the engines were very good. I can't remember exactly which engines it had now off the top of my head, but the engines it had were much better than the 630, the P630, which gave it a much better speed, much better carrying capability. The plane's also quite a small plane. It's not exactly a pretty plane. Um, it's a bit of an odd-looking one for sure, but it is a very it's got very good lift rating. It's a very compact plane as well, so it doesn't have a big target to be hit. So it's an interesting little plane in that respect. Now it has two people on board, the pilot and the co-pilot. Sorry, the pilot and the gunner, sat in line with each other. Um, yeah, it's going to be an interesting little plane to see in action. So this one has a single 20mm Hispano with two 303 MAC 1934 machine guns, with twin rear-facing 303 machine guns as well. The machine guns, there's one at the top and one at the bottom, I believe, of this plane. So it can be... The bottom one is retractable. I believe it faces down, so the rear gunner can shoot targets on the ground. It's an interesting plane nonetheless. It also has the ability to carry up to 1,100 pounds of bombs as well. So again, it will be quite useful in that respect. So that's the attackers looked at. Now, brief look at fighters. Well, fighters, we know we're going to be getting a few of them. There are a few already in the game, for instance, that we have in separate countries. The DE 520, the Duatin DE 520, of course, which is one of the best fighters available to France at the time, and that was the peak of their fighter technology. So we know we're getting that plane. We already have it in game. Hopefully there'll be some upgraded versions of it, some slightly different versions of it, although there's not really much you can do to it. I think one of the biggest issues for the French planes we're going to have is the fact that they are a bit like British planes, but lacking cannons. They tend to be very machine gun heavy, with a very big lack of cannons on board. I guess the main plane I'm going to talk about right now is the Arsenal de l'Aisne number 10, which is a prototype plane, and as you can see, it's a bit of an odd looking plane as well. It's actually a biplane, possibly the fastest biplane made for the war. I know you're probably looking at me sort of skew-whiff now, going, what am I talking about? But if you see how the front wing and the rear wing are offset, it technically makes this a biplane. The Model 10 was a prototype in development when France fell. It's not exactly pretty, but it is interesting. The plane featured a cockpit for two people, allowing for a rear-facing gun at the extreme aft end of the fuselage. It also allowed for excellent view of the rear gunner, so they had very good view for enemies coming in on them. This is kind of odd for a fighter to have the ability to have a rear gunner. It's quite a long plane, from the front because it does hold a big V12 engine in the front, giving the plane relatively good balance all in all, with the weight of the pilot and many of the systems at the back, the engine at the front. It has a pretty good weight distribution to it and a very good centre of gravity. The plane was near completion at the fall of France and was allowed to be finished. In testing, the plane reached speeds of up to 340 miles per hour and could stay in the air for at least an hour and a half, getting to around about 32,000 feet. The finished plane was sadly taken off to Germany for evaluation in 1943, and not much else is known. We do know what weapons it was going to have, though. It was going to have a single 20mm Hispano through the nose. Then it was also going to have two MAC 1934 machine guns in the wings. However, nobody's sure which wings they were going to be in, whether it's going to be the top deck or the bottom deck wings. You would kind of think it would probably be in the top deck wings, but it depends how the line of sight is for the pilot. Yeah, it's one of those interesting things. Nobody was sure exactly what they were going to do with it. Now, this plane I can see being a premium plane, of course, but I kind of hope we do get it because it's a very interesting plane. It also had twin MAC 1934s in the rear, of course, for the rear gunner. Now, for other French fighters, well, we've got the Bloch MB-150, which was an all-metal aircraft made in the late 30s. Relatively okay fighter, not great. I imagine we'll be getting that as an early sort of plane to sort of take up. It wasn't great, and it was very outmatched by the German competition. It was just serviceable in World War II. It did hold enough firepower, stability to hold a case for itself, but it was completely outmatched by the Bf-109s. But it's a plane that we probably will get. I can't imagine it's going to be too popular. That one comes with two Hispanos, 20mm Hispanos, and two MAC 1934 7.7mm. There was a variant with quad 7.7mm as well, but yeah, that it's going to be a very low BR plane. So we'll probably get the MB1 150, and there was a few different models of that as well. So you might get a couple of those planes in the area. Another plane I imagine we'll be getting is the Bloch MB700, which was a prototype. Again, a prototype plane. Sadly, it was blown up by conquering Germans, so we didn't really get much detail on it. It's possibly going to be an okayish low tier plane, but it's not. It's not going to be anything overly special. The main thing is it does have twin cannons, twin 20mm Hispanos, and again twin 7.707 machine guns as well. It was a relatively fast plane though, so that's one of the good parts of it. French were quite good at making fast planes, so that is a bonus for them. One of the other things we're likely to get is the float planes. And probably most notably of the float planes will be the Lacatore, the Laticore. Sorry, I'm terrible at pronouncing things, as you probably realise. The Laticore 298. Now, this was the pinnacle of seaplane design. Now, it's a torpedo bomber float plane, but it will fall in that sort of line of attacker / fighter area. I imagine we will get quite a few fighters from France with floats. It's There's not much on this plane though, unfortunately. It was designed for torpedoing. I believe it did have a 7.7 the 707s on board as well, but it was completely outmatched by the German air forces. And this is the story of all of the French planes, unfortunately. It's until we get to the post-war mark. Sorry, my computer just decided to beep there. We're going to have issue with a lot of the planes, and it's it's going to make things a little bit tricky. I guess one other fighter that we might get is the Koolhaven FK-58, which was a Dutch plane made in the Netherlands. So it's a plane we might be getting for the French tech tree. Again, though, it's just hard to sort of really think where it would sit, just because it was a fast plane, it was a good plane, it was a very maneuverable plane, but it lacked firepower. It had 4 Browning machine guns on board, which, as we know, really can't do much past the first tier. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with some of these. So, I'm going to end the speculation there and end this video here as well. Let me know what you think of what planes we might be getting for the French tech tree. There's lots of prototypes available for France, which is kind of useful. There's lots of options for using other nations' planes. I mean, the French Air Force used pretty much every nation's plane during the war. From Russians, they had units in Russia fighting flying Yaks, Yak 9s, Yak 7s, Yak 3s, even the Yak 1. There was a few flying those at the beginning of the Second World War. They had many British and American planes when they were fighting in Africa, for instance. They carried the Spitfire, they carried the Corsair. They used pretty much whatever they could get, and that kind of makes it a little bit hard. I believe there was even some French units were using the PO2. The French also had, as I said before, they had captured Zero. They had a Hayabusa as well, the Ki-43. They had a few different planes. They used the P-51 Mustangs. They also used German planes as well, you know, because they were occupied. They had German planes for the German sympathizers in their air force, but then the Vichy French, the French fighting for the freedom of their country, were flying British planes. So, and American planes, of course, Allied planes in general. So, it does make it very, very tricky. I mean, are we going to get a tech tree where we got a Dornier DO-24 next to a Douglas A-20 Havoc? We just don't know. And that's, I guess, the tricky part. I think the hardest part for the French tech tree is going to be filling out the sort of late war period, the things from 1941 to 1945. There's not really much to fill in that gap, and it's kind of surprised me that the French Air Force has been introduced for that, because yes, I know there's a few paper planes in there, but they are very much paper planes. There's really not much. There's really not much meat to the French tech tree. That's what I'm trying to say. Until we get post World War II or pre World War II. So yeah, it's going to be a hard one. And even with the bombers, as you've seen, the French were very underprepared. They did have planes available, but in very small numbers. And some of the planes that they had looked great. I think which one was it? It was the... Where am I? the Maranthe-Saulnaire MS-405-406 looks fantastic. It looks like it's an absolute killer. But it was completely outmatched by Bf-109s, by its German counterparts. It really was not up to scratch to fight them. It just, yeah, it's going to make it very tricky. It's going to be interesting to see what they do, because at the moment I can't see how Gaijin are going to get around their sort of policy of only having planes that actually existed to a stage that they were made as a prototype, because a lot of these planes that they're sort of talking about and people are thinking of, they're just purely sort of, well, they're just planes that really didn't exist very well. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that goes. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know below what you think of what we're going to be getting for France. I do expect we're going. I do expect we're going to be getting a lot of float planes though, and that's kind of something that I am quite interested in and quite excited for. Okay, guys. Until next time, this is Screezler out. Bye bye.